Most people go to work, they clock in, work their shift, clock out, go home, rinse, and repeat. But unfortunately, for some people, they never get to clock out. Hello, true crimerers. Today we're doing something a little different. I'm going to be telling you 3 stories where, unfortunately, people were murdered at their place of work. Specifically, in this video, we're going to focus on restaurants. Viewer discretion is advised. Before we get started in this video, if you want to see a lot more short form true crime stories from me, you can head on over to TikTok, and my name over there is the same as over here, Making a True Crimerer, and I have probably over 2,000 videos over there for you to watch. Now, into the stories. Unfortunately, there are a lot of victims in this particular video, and I really don't have a lot of personal information on pretty much most of them. So this particular video will be short on details related to the people who were killed. Our first story takes place in Irving, Texas at a Taco Bell. It was a cold day, January 26, 1991. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, 2 officers pulled over a vehicle where 2 teenagers were driving. They were driving erratically, which is why they were pulled over. But when police went to look inside the vehicle, just with their flashlights, they noticed something very, very strange. In the car was a Taco Bell takeout bag, and in that bag was literally overflowing wads of cash. When the police questioned these 2 teenagers, they really weren't very forthcoming. They weren't saying where they got it from. So when the call went, they basically put out a call to dispatch, and they wanted to let the surrounding officers know to please check on the Taco Bell restaurants in the area. There was about 5 or 6 in the Irving, Texas area at the time. One after the other, all the Taco Bell seemed to be normal. The lights were on. The employees were fine. Everyone was getting ready for the day, except for one Taco Bell. When police officers pulled up to this particular one, everything was dark. The lights were off. There seemed to be no signs of activity in the restaurant, so police would approach it very cautiously. Now, the doors to the restaurant were locked, and when police tried to look in, they couldn't see anybody. Given that there was evidence of a bag full of cash from possibly a Taco Bell, they decided they needed to enter this particular building. So they would prop open the drive-through window, and one of the officers would crawl through that to get inside. What that officer found was nothing short of a nightmare. There were 4 bodies all piled up in the back of the restaurant. The victims were 16-year-old Teresa Fraga, 23-year-old Frank Fraga, 28-year-old Michael Phelan, and 35-year-old Sun Trang Nguyen. They were piled up in the back of the restaurant inside the walk-in freezer. Teresa and Frank, they both worked at the Taco Bell, and they were actually, obviously with their names, they were both cousins. They were family. Teresa was also pregnant, and she also had a young child back at home. All 4 victims had been shot to death, what appeared to be execution style. So who were the 2 men they pulled over with the bag full of cash? 17-year-old Jerome Green and 19-year-old Jesse Carlos San Miguel. The bag that they had with the cash in it did have traces, small traces, of blood on it. And when police were investigating this particular Taco Bell with the bodies, there was a massive amount of cash missing. So these 2 young men were arrested and charged with the murders of all 4 people. Jesse, one of the killers, he had actually already been charged with other burglaries in the area, and he was out on bail when this murder took place. So essentially what happened that morning was that the 2 men saw one of the employees, and this was Michael Phelan. They saw him leave the building to throw away the garbage, and as he came back inside the building, that's when they accosted him, put a gun to his head, and forced him back inside. They then took Michael Phelan and brought him to the safe, as well as any drawers that may have had money in them, with a gun to his head, forced him to hand over all of the money in the building. One of the victims, Mr. Nguyen, he did not work at the restaurant, actually. He had pulled up to the Taco Bell that morning because he was there to pick up the 2 cousins. And unfortunately, the robbers saw him and they couldn't have any witnesses. So they went out there with a gun and forced him inside the building. According to statements from the assailants, what happened then was that all of the people were forced inside the freezer. Then the assailants closed them in and locked them in, and no harm was done. They then took all the money and they began to leave the restaurant. This is when Jesse decided to turn around, go back to the freezer, open it, and he said to them, "Give me one reason not to kill you." And whatever they may have said, it didn't matter. He forced all of them to turn around, and one by one, he put a bullet inside the back of each of their heads. So the 2 men would go on trial, and Jesse, being the admitted shooter of all 4 victims, he was convicted and sentenced to death. And in 2000, he was executed by lethal injection. Jerome Green, since he was not the shooter, but he was committing a robbery within a, felony murder, basically, he was charged or sentenced to life in prison, but was given a parole period of, I believe, 15 years. And he was eligible at one point in 2004 for parole, but he was denied. Our next story takes place in Queens, New York. It is now May 24th, 2000. This time we are going to a Wendy's. Inside the restaurant that evening were 7 employees. 27-year-old manager Jean Augusti, 44-year-old Ramon Nazario, 40-year-old Ali Ibadat, 23-year-old Anita Smith, 19-year-old Jeremy Mele, 18-year-old Jaquion Johnson, and 23-year-old Patrick Castro. A few minutes before midnight on May 24th, 2000, everyone was getting ready to leave for the night. Everyone was doing their, closing duties when the manager, Jean Augusti, had made a page over the intercom for all of the employees to come to the office. He said there was going to be a very important meeting that they all needed to be a part of right then and there. When the employees all walked into the office, they were met with a very terrifying surprise. 30-year-old Craig Godineau and 36-year-old John Taylor were also in the office. They were armed with guns. John Taylor was a former employee of this particular Wendy's, but he was either let go or left on his own accord, but either way, it was under very suspicious circumstances, possibly suspected of a theft. When all of the employees were now in the manager's office, the 2 men would tie up all of the employees. And this is 7 people. They used rope, they used duct tape, they also shoved things in all of their mouths to keep them from screaming or talking. Then they forced all of the employees, all 7 people, inside of the freezer. This is where, for some reason, it always happens. They then put plastic, like Wendy's takeout bags, over all of their heads. Then the 2 men who were armed with .380 caliber semi-automatic pistols, would go down the line one by one and shot each of them in the back of the head execution style. The two assailants then closed the freezer door and took off with a whopping $2,400. That's like seven people's lives to them was worth $2,400. That's disgusting. First of all, no amount of money is worth it, but $2,400, they were willing to do that. That's insane. By a miracle, two of the individuals would survive. That would be the 18-year-old Jaquion Johnson and then the 23-year-old Patrick Castro. Patrick was shot, but luckily the bullet did not hit him in any lethal locations, so he was able to free himself, and he got out of the freezer and he called 911, and he was able to provide a description of who did this. So both men were eventually arrested not too soon after the incident took place. I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks or so. And they both went to trial. And John Taylor, he was convicted and he was sentenced to death. Craig Godinot was not sentenced to death. He was convicted, but he had a very low IQ and some pretty severe mental disabilities, so he was not eligible for the death penalty. So he got life in prison without parole. And then, a few years down the road, John Taylor's death sentence, because again, this is in New York, and the death penalty was, I think it was at one point, gotten rid of. So his sentence was actually then commuted to life in prison without parole. Our third and final story takes place at Domino's Pizza. It was a chilly December 9th, 1985 in Glendale, California. 25-year-old Mitchell Sims and his 20-year-old delinquent girlfriend, her name was Ruby Paget, well, they were holding up a Domino's restaurant. There were 2 employees inside the building also at the time. So when they had their guns to the employees' heads, and they were demanding money, one of the employees, the manager said, basically warned the robbers that you might want to be on the lookout because our delivery driver is expected back here any moment now. He just delivered a pizza to a nearby motel, and he will be back to the store. This is when Mitchell Sims, he began to laugh and smile and do all the things evil movie villains would do in this situation, I guess. He then unbuttoned his shirt, he took it off, and he was wearing a Domino's shirt. And on that shirt was a name badge. The name badge said John Harrigan. Who was John Harrigan? He was the delivery driver who had gone to the motel. The man wearing his name badge and shirt was not him. You see, what they had done was they had placed an order for a Domino's pizza to go to their motel room. They then, when the delivery driver got there, Mr. Harrigan, he was 21 years old, they grabbed him, pulled him inside, and they shot and killed him and threw him in the bathtub of the motel. This wasn't the first murder or first act of robbery that these two had done for Domino's. You see, Mitchell Sims had worked at Domino's Pizza for quite some time. He started off on the very bottom, and then eventually he became a manager. And he then left Domino's after many years of employment because he thought he deserved a much larger bonus, but he wasn't being given that bonus, so he left the company on very angry terms. Now, at the beginning of this particular story, we're in California, but where he was working for Domino's was all the way in South Carolina. If we rewind about a month or so before this happened in Glendale, California, November of 1985, we are now in Hanahan, South Carolina. Mitchell Sims, after leaving his manager job, would get hired on as a part-time delivery driver at the Domino's there in Hanahan. And then, a couple of weeks after he was hired to do that, on December 4th, 1985, a employee of a Domino's, he is covered in blood. He goes and stumbles into a police station to let them know that he and another one of his co-workers were just robbed and they were both shot. The man who stumbled into the police department was 24-year-old Greg Melky. So police went to that Domino's restaurant in Hanahan, and they in fact found an employee who was shot to death. And that was 24-year-old Chris Zur. And then Melky was obviously brought to the hospital, but he would eventually succumb to his wounds, and he would die as well. This made, obviously, news. It was a big story. So Paget and his little girlfriend, they decided to pick up and flee South Carolina, and they drove all the way to California. Now we're back to the beginning. In Glendale, California at the Domino's. Two employees are being held up with guns, being demanded they hand over all the money, and, well, they're probably about to get killed. By a crazy happenstance, miracle, whatever you want to call it, a Domino's employee who was not on the clock at the time, he happened to drive by his Domino's, the one in Glendale. They walk into the restaurant, and the manager who is outside of the Domino's, who was not on the clock, he went into the restaurant, and the employees pretended they didn't know him. I guess at this point, the robbers had the guns maybe behind their back. They were hiding them. They didn't know anything was really going on. So the manager off the clock was allowed to leave, and he obviously said something is very wrong here. I don't know who these two gentlemen are who are in the restaurant with them. They say they don't know me. Something's wrong. So the manager, who was with his wife as well, went to police. By the time police got to the Glendale store, Domino's, the two strangers were gone, and the restaurant was dark. So they kind of walk in there cautiously. They open up the freezer. Yes, it's always a freezer. And there are two people inside. They have nooses around their neck. And they were basically being strangled, because where they tied them up to was almost like they were hanging them. But the police got there just in time and were able to free both employees. And so they would both end up surviving. Police were able to then quickly find that the motel the murderous duo was staying at, and that's where they found the delivery driver's body. The description was given out, and this is when South Carolina kind of figured out that this had happened in California, and in South Carolina they pretty much knew who the assailants were, so they were able to put out a, all points bulletin, find these two people, and they were eventually found. They would both be charged with the murders that all took place, the robberies, kidnapping, etc. And Mitchell Sims, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to death. But he is still awaiting, as far as I can tell, his death sentence to be carried out. His girlfriend, 20-year-old Paget, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. This has always been one of my biggest fears, especially lately, of working in public, working in retail or wherever, of something like this happening, because there are so many stories like this, and I will very much likely do another video very similar to this, because there are, sadly, a lot more stories where this exact type thing happens. Sometimes the people are caught, and sometimes these people are still roaming the world free. But that is it for today's stories. I hope you found them interesting. Is this something you guys would like to see more of? Were these compilation type videos where there are similar stories like this? Let me know below. Let me know. Tell me, what do you think? And then, of course, as usual, like I said at the beginning, please make sure you follow me over on TikTok at makingatruecrimerer. Make sure you head on over into my link tree below if you want to purchase any merch. We sell some t-shirts, we sell hoodies, we sell a beanie, we sell mugs and a wine glass and bada bing, bada boom, bada blah, 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 blah. Stop it. Okay. And then lastly, if you have a case you would like me to cover, please also check in my link tree. Go to my crimerer case list. There's about 4,200 names on there or so. So if you're on a computer, hit Control F and search for the name you want me to cover. And if you're on a phone, just hit the little 3 dots at the top and then click on Find and Replace and then type in the name and it'll show you. If the name doesn't come up, just send me an email to mikey@truecrimerer.com, which will be in the description below. And just send me the name of the victims, the name of the assailants if you know it, and then where it happened and the time frame it happened in. It can be anything. It can be unsolved. It can be missing people. It can be solved cases. It can be cases like what you heard today. Anything you want related to true crime, and I will add it to my list. So. But pretty please make sure you check the list first. I get a lot of emails with duplicate names because people aren't checking the list. It just saves me some time if you can. Thank you. All right, that is it for today's video. I will see you back here in another day or so with another one. But until then, cha-cha for now. True crime Roonies. What am I doing? What is this? I don't know.